The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Rosalie Fairchild ducked behind a weathered boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild stallion. The year was 1876, and what had begun as a simple journey to visit her ailing aunt in Helena had transformed into a desperate flight for her life. The stagecoach robbery wasn't supposed to end like this, with her separated from the other passengers, pursued by outlaws through unfamiliar territory, as sunset painted the rugged landscape in dangerous shadows. "Should have stayed in Sacramento," she muttered, adjusting the torn hem of her travel dress. California had been safe, predictable. Her father's general store had provided a comfortable life, even after his passing left her to manage it alone at 22. But duty called when her aunt's letter arrived. And now Rosalie found herself alone in Montana territory, with nothing but the small satchel clutched in her trembling hands, and the sound of men's voices growing closer. Miles away, Preston Yates tightened the cinch on his saddle as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. At 28, he'd already lived several lifetimes: Confederate soldier turned ranch hand, then deputy, and now a fully fledged Montana lawman. His reputation for tracking outlaws across impossible terrain had earned him respect throughout the territory, though few knew the ghosts that drove him to such relentless pursuit. "Sheriff's lookin' for you, Yates," called Benjamin, a young stable hand from the nearby town of Silverwood. "Says there's been trouble with the Blackwell gang again. Stage hit about 15 miles east." Preston's jaw tightened as he secured his Winchester rifle to his saddle. "Any casualties?" "Drivers wounded but alive. Passengers mostly accounted for, except one woman. They think she ran when the shooting started." "One woman, out there alone?" Preston swung onto his horse, a powerful black stallion named Thunder. "Tell the sheriff I'm riding out now. We've got maybe an hour of light left." The Montana wilderness was no place for anyone to be stranded after dark, let alone an unaccompanied woman unfamiliar with the territory. If the Blackwell gang was involved, the situation was even worse than he'd thought. Those men left no witnesses. As night descended, Rosalie found herself on increasingly treacherous ground. The outlaws' voices had faded, but now she faced a new enemy, the unforgiving landscape itself. She'd climbed higher into rocky terrain hoping to spot a settlement or ranch, but darkness made navigation nearly impossible. Her city boots slipped on loose stone, and she gasped as the ground suddenly gave way beneath her. She clawed desperately at the rocky edge, managing to catch herself as loose stones tumbled into darkness below. Heart pounding, she clung to the cliff face, legs dangling over what felt like a bottomless drop. Her fingers began to cramp almost immediately, and terror gripped her as cruelly as she gripped the stone. "Help!" she cried, voice thin in the vast wilderness. "Somebody please help me." Preston followed the tracks with practiced precision, even as darkness made the task increasingly difficult. The woman had been clever, avoiding open ground and sticking to rocky terrain where possible. But her trail told him she was panicked, moving too quickly, and most worryingly heading higher into dangerous territory. The sound came faintly at first, a woman's voice calling for help. Preston urged Thunder forward, following the sound until he came upon 3 men from town who joined the search, their lanterns creating small islands of light in the darkness. "Sheriff sent us to help," explained one man Preston recognized as the blacksmith. "We heard screaming from up ahead." "She's hanging from the cliff," cried another, pointing toward a rocky outcrop barely visible in the moonlight. Preston dismounted in an instant, tossing his hat aside as he assessed the situation. The woman had somehow wandered onto Devil's Ridge, a treacherous formation known for its sudden drops and unstable edges. From where he stood, he could just make out fingers clutching the ledge. "Get ropes," he ordered, already moving toward the cliff. "And more light." "It's too dangerous in the dark," protested the blacksmith. "One wrong step and you'll both be gone. We should wait for morning, she'll be dead by morning," Preston snapped, removing his gun, belt, and jacket. He examined the cliff face, calculating the fastest route to reach her. The rock was sharp and unforgiving with few clear handholds. "She's hanging from the cliff," they cried again, as if he needed reminding of the stakes. Preston locked eyes with the men, his voice steady with determination. "Then I'll climb till my hands bleed." Without another word, he began his ascent, fingers seeking purchase on the rough stone. The rock bit into his skin immediately, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing only on each movement, each handhold. Years of ranch work and manhunts had hardened his body for exactly this kind of endurance. "Hold on, madam," he called up. "I'm coming to you." Rosalie's arms trembled with exhaustion. She'd been clinging to the ledge for what felt like hours, though it had likely been only minutes. Her fingers had gone numb, and she knew she couldn't hold on much longer. When she heard the deep voice calling up to her, she nearly sobbed with relief. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm slipping." "Just a little longer," Preston urged, his own voice strained as he navigated the treacherous climb. He could see her now, a pale face framed by dark hair that had come loose from its pins, eyes wide with fear. He was almost within reach when her fingers slipped. Rosalie screamed as she felt herself falling, but in the same instant, a strong hand clasped her wrist. The sudden stop sent pain shooting through her shoulder, but all she could focus on was the man who now held her life in his bleeding hand. "I've got you," Preston assured her, his grip firm despite the blood seeping between his fingers. With his other hand anchored in a crevice, he braced himself against the cliff face. "Give me your other hand." Swinging precariously, Rosalie reached up, and he caught her second wrist. With strength born of desperation, Preston managed to pull her upward until she could grasp the ledge again. Together, they worked to get her back onto somewhat stable ground, though they were still perilously positioned on the cliff face. "We need to move sideways," he instructed, breathing heavily. "There's a wider ledge about 10 feet to our right." Following his guidance, Rosalie inched along the cliff face, acutely aware of the drop below them and the warmth of the stranger's body behind her, occasionally steadying her with a hand at her waist. When they finally reached the wider ledge, she collapsed against the rock wall, trembling with exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, finally getting a proper look at her rescuer in the dim moonlight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was. His hands were indeed bleeding, torn raw from the climb. "Preston Yates," he introduced himself, his voice a low rumble that somehow made her feel safer despite their precarious position. "Deputy Marshal for this territory." "Rosalie Fairchild," she replied, still breathless. "I was on the stagecoach to Helena when we were attacked." Preston nodded grimly. "The Blackwell gang, they've been terrorizing stages in this territory for months." From below, voices called up to them. "Yates, we've got ropes, thank God," Rosalie murmured. "I thought we might be stuck here all night." Preston's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Wouldn't be my first night on a cliff, madam, but I reckon we could both use a more comfortable resting place." The rescue operation proceeded slowly and carefully. Preston secured Rosalie with one of the ropes lowered by the search party, instructing her on how to rappel down with their guidance. He followed only after ensuring she had reached safety, ignoring the burning pain in his lacerated hands. When they both stood on solid ground, Rosalie swayed with exhaustion. Without hesitation, Preston steadied her with a hand at her elbow, careful not to stain her dress with his bloodied palms. "You need a doctor for those hands," she observed, her voice soft with concern. "And you need somewhere safe to rest," he countered. "Silverwood's just a few hours' ride from here. We can make it by midnight if we push on." The blacksmith stepped forward. "Sheriff sent word to prepare rooms at the boarding house. The lady can ride with me. You're in no condition to manage a horse with those hands, Yates." Preston's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'll manage. Miss Fairchild rides with me." Something in his tone brooked no argument, and Rosalie found herself lifted onto Preston's stallion moments later, the deputy marshal mounting behind her despite his injured hands. As they began the journey to Silverwood, she became acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, the careful way he held the reins to avoid pressing his wounded hands against her, and the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to surround him. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly when they had ridden some distance from the others. "Climb the cliff, I mean. You could have been killed." Preston was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low against her ear, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Because it needed doing, Miss Fairchild. And sometimes that's reason enough." The town of Silverwood emerged from the darkness like a mirage, its scattered lights promising safety after the harrowing events of the evening. Rosalie had never imagined she would find a dusty frontier settlement so beautiful. But as they rode down the main street, the wooden buildings and oil lamps seemed as welcoming as any grand city. "Sheriff's office first," Preston directed, guiding his horse toward a sturdy building with a lamp still burning in the window. "He'll want your statement about the robbery." Sheriff Thomas Miller was a stocky man with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. He welcomed Rosalie with gruff kindness, providing coffee while she recounted the attack on the stagecoach. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Fairchild," the sheriff remarked when she had finished. "The Blackwell gang doesn't usually leave witnesses." "The driver?" Rosalie asked, suddenly remembering the kind older man who had pointed out landmarks during the journey. "Took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. The other passengers are at Doc Wilson's house for the night, being tended to for minor injuries." "And the money they stole?" Sheriff Miller exchanged a look with Preston. "Gold shipment bound for the bank in Helena. $10,000. Rosalie's eyes widened. "I had no idea. No wonder they were so determined." "Which is why you'll be staying here in Silverwood until we capture them," Preston stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He winced slightly as the sheriff began cleaning and bandaging his torn hands. "But my aunt is expecting me in Helena," Rosalie protested. "She's ill, that's why I was traveling there in the first place." "I'll send a telegram first thing tomorrow," Sheriff Miller assured her. "Better your aunt worries for a few days than mourns you forever. The Blackwells will be looking for you, Miss Fairchild." "You're the only one who got a clear look at their faces." Rosalie hadn't considered this. During the robbery, she had indeed glimpsed the leader's face when his bandana slipped. He'd noticed her noticing, which explained why he'd ordered one of his men to take care of the woman in the blue dress. "Mrs. Parker has a room ready at her boarding house," the sheriff continued. "Deputy Yates will escort you there. Try to get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." Outside, the night had grown cooler and Rosalie shivered in her torn dress. Without a word, Preston removed his coat with his bandaged hands and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, and it carried that same scent of leather and pine. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Preston merely nodded, leading her down the street toward a two-story building with a small sign identifying it as Parker's lodging house. As they walked, Rosalie became aware of how he positioned himself between her and the few men still wandering the streets, his right hand never straying far from his holster despite his injuries. Mrs. Parker proved to be a plump, motherly woman who clucked over Rosalie's disheveled appearance and immediately promised hot water for bathing and clean clothes borrowed from her daughter. "And you, Deputy Yates," the woman added, fixing him with a stern look. "I've prepared the room next to Miss Fairchild's. Doc Wilson said you're to rest those hands, or you'll be no use to anyone when it comes time to catch those outlaws." Preston looked as though he might argue but ultimately nodded. "I'll check the perimeter first," while Mrs. Parker bustled about preparing the promised bath. Rosalie sank onto the edge of the bed in her assigned room, the events of the day finally catching up to her. She was alive, against all odds, because a man she'd never met had risked his life to save hers. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Preston stood in the hallway, his tall frame nearly filling the doorway. "Everything's secure," he informed her. "I'll be next door if you need anything." "Your hands," Rosalie said, noticing a spot of fresh blood seeping through the bandages. "They must be painful." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. "I've had worse." "That doesn't make it hurt any less now," she observed quietly. For a moment, Preston's carefully maintained composure seemed to soften. "Get some rest, Miss Fairchild. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As he turned to leave, Rosalie called after him, "It's Rosalie. After dangling from a cliff together, I think we can dispense with formalities." The barest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Good night, Rosalie." "Good night, Preston." Sleep came surprisingly easily despite the strange surroundings and the danger that still lurked beyond the town's borders. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was knowing that Preston Yates was just one wall away, his presence somehow more reassuring than any lock or weapon could be. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Silverwood. News of the stagecoach robbery and Rosalie's dramatic rescue had spread through town, making her something of a local celebrity. Mrs. Parker served breakfast with generous helpings of gossip, informing Rosalie that a posse was forming to hunt down the Blackwell gang. Deputy Yates rode out at dawn, the landlady mentioned, refilling Rosalie's coffee cup. "Said to tell you he'd be back by midday and not to leave the boarding house without escort." Rosalie frowned, an unexpected disappointment settling in her chest at the news of Preston's absence. "Did he say where he was going?" "Tracking, most likely. Man's like a bloodhound when he sets his mind to something." Mrs. Parker lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They say he once tracked an outlaw for 3 weeks across the Badlands, brought him in half dead but alive to stand trial." That's the kind of lawman Preston Yates is. The morning passed slowly as Rosalie waited, alternating between watching the street from her window and helping Mrs. Parker with household tasks to distract herself. The borrowed dress, a simple blue calico, was a bit large but clean and whole, which was more than could be said for her own travel outfit. Just past noon, she spotted a now familiar black stallion approaching the boarding house and hurried downstairs, trying to ignore the inexplicable quickening of her pulse. Preston dismounted stiffly, his bandaged hands clearly causing him pain despite his efforts to hide it. "You found something," Rosalie stated as she stepped onto the porch, recognizing the intense focus in his expression. Preston nodded, removing his hat. "They're camped about 15 miles north in the foothills, sheriffs gathering men now. Will you go after them today, first light tomorrow?" "Too risky to approach their camp in the dark." He studied her for a moment. "You look rested, that's good." Rosalie smiled, touched by his concern. "And you look like you haven't slept at all. "Sleep's overrated," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Sheriff wants to see you. He has more questions about what you witnessed during the robbery." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Rosalie was acutely aware of the glances they attracted. In a town this size, she supposed a new face was noteworthy, especially one connected to recent excitement. What surprised her was how many of those glances seemed directed at Preston, or more specifically, at the two of them together. "You're something of a legend here," she observed quietly. Preston shrugged. "Small towns make legends out of ordinary men doing their jobs." "There was nothing ordinary about climbing that cliff in the dark," Rosalie countered. "Most men wouldn't have attempted it." Before he could respond, they reached the sheriff's office, where a group of men were gathered around a crude map spread across a desk. Sheriff Miller greeted Rosalie with a nod, then turned his attention back to planning the next day's raid. "We'll approach from the east, using the tree line for cover," he was explaining. "Yates, you'll take point since you know the terrain." Preston joined the discussion, leaving Rosalie to wait quietly near the door. As she listened to the men plan what would clearly be a dangerous confrontation, she felt a growing unease. These outlaws had already shown themselves willing to kill, and Preston's bandaged hands would surely hamper his ability to defend himself. The thought of him being injured or worse created an unexpected knot of anxiety in her chest, which was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. She'd known the man less than a day, yet there was no denying the connection she felt to him, forged in those terrifying moments on the cliff face when he'd held her life in his hands. "Miss Fairchild," Sheriff Miller's voice broke through her thoughts, "I need you to look at these sketches. Tell me if you recognize any of these men from the robbery." Rosalie examined the crude drawings, immediately identifying the leader. "That's him, the one whose face I saw. He has a scar here," she indicated her right cheek, "and his eyes were very pale, blue or gray." "Ezra Blackwell," the sheriff confirmed grimly. "Meanest son of a, excuse me, miss, meanest outlaw in 3 territories. And you're sure it was him leading the robbery?" "Positive. He's the one who ordered them to take care of me when he realized I'd seen his face." Preston's expression darkened at this information. "All the more reason to keep you under guard until we bring them in." The meeting concluded with final assignments for the posse members. As they filed out, Sheriff Miller pulled Preston aside for a private word, leaving Rosalie to wait by the door. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, she could see the sheriff's concerned glance toward Preston's bandaged hands and the deputy's dismissive headshake in response. When they stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows between the buildings. Preston seemed preoccupied, his brow furrowed in thought. "What will you do after the Blackwells are captured?" he asked suddenly as they walked back toward the boarding house. "Continue to Helena, I suppose so," Rosalie replied, realizing she hadn't thought that far ahead. "My aunt is expecting me and I should check on her after that." She hesitated. "I'm not sure. My father's store in Sacramento is being managed by his partner now." "There's nothing really calling me back." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "Montana's growing. Plenty of opportunities for someone with business experience." The idea hadn't occurred to Rosalie, but now that Preston mentioned it, she found herself considering the possibility. Sacramento held painful memories since her father's death, and the thought of returning to run the store without him had always felt hollow. "Does Silverwood have a general store?" she asked, curious. "Old man Jenkins runs it, but he's been talking about retiring for years. His son moved to Denver last spring, so there's no one to take over." Preston glanced at her with new interest. "You thinking of staying?" "Maybe," Rosalie admitted. "It depends on many things, I suppose. Including whether certain people might want her to stay," she thought but didn't say. They reached the boarding house just as Mrs. Parker was placing a closed sign on her front door. "There you are," she exclaimed. "I was about to send search party. Supper's getting cold and we have other guests arriving tonight." The other guests turned out to be the remaining passengers from the stagecoach, released from the doctor's care and waiting for transportation to Helena. Rosalie was relieved to see them all recovering well from the ordeal, though their presence meant conversation at dinner revolved entirely around the robbery and their narrow escapes. "And then Miss Fairchild just disappeared into the brush," recounted Mr. Holloway, a traveling salesman who had been particularly vocal during the attack. "We thought for sure they'd caught her, but she outfoxed them. Only to nearly fall to my death from a cliff," Rosalie added wryly. "Not my most strategic decision. But it brought you Deputy Yates," observed Mrs. Holloway with a meaningful glance between the two. "Providence works in mysterious ways." Preston, who had remained largely silent throughout the meal, rose abruptly at this comment. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check in with the sheriff before nightfall." "Your dinner," Mrs. Parker protested, "was excellent as always," he assured her, already moving toward the door. "Miss Fairchild, I advise staying indoors tonight. Sheriffs posted men around town, but caution is still warranted." With that, he was gone, leaving Rosalie to field knowing looks from the other diners and an uncomfortable sensation that she'd somehow caused his hasty departure. Later that evening, unable to sleep despite her comfortable accommodations, Rosalie sat by her window watching the quiet street below. A nearly full moon illuminated the town, casting everything in silver and shadow. She spotted one of the sheriff's deputies making rounds, his rifle gleaming dully in the moonlight. Movement near the stables caught her attention. A tall figure emerged, leading a horse Preston, she realized with a start. He wasn't wearing his usual coat or hat, just a simple shirt and trousers, as if he'd decided to ride out on impulse rather than with planning. Without stopping to question her actions, Rosalie grabbed her shawl and hurried downstairs, careful to avoid the creaky step that might wake Mrs. Parker. By the time she reached the street, Preston was mounting his horse. "It's dangerous to be out alone," she called softly, causing him to turn sharply in her direction. Preston frowned as he recognized her. "You should be inside." "So should you, with injured hands and a posse to lead at dawn." Rosalie moved closer, noting the tension in his posture. "Where are you going?" For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer or simply ride away. Instead, he sighed, some of the rigidity leaving his shoulders. "Just riding the perimeter. Can't sleep. Because of tomorrow's raid." Preston shook his head slightly. "I've let enough passes, it's not that." Rosalie stepped closer until she stood beside his horse. "Then what is it?" His eyes met hers in the moonlight, and something in them made her breath catch a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, quickly masked but unmistakably present. "You should go inside, Rosalie. And you should rest those hands," she countered. "Mrs. Parker told me you were out tracking at dawn." "You've been pushing yourself all day. I heal fast." "Even so." Impulsively, she reached out to touch his arm. "The Blackwells will still be there tomorrow, and you'll face them better with some rest." Preston looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight release of tension around his mouth. "You're probably right," he conceded, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his injured state. "Walk back with me." They returned to the boarding house in companionable silence, the night air cool around them. At the bottom of the stairs, Preston paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? Coming after me?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Returning the favor, I suppose." Rosalie felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the shawl around her shoulders. "Good night, Preston." "Good night, Rosalie." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Rosalie found herself wondering about the man who had saved her life. What drove him? What demons kept him from sleep? And why did she feel so drawn to someone she'd known for barely 24 hours? Questions without answers, at least for now. But as she drifted off to sleep, one certainty remained. Her life had changed irrevocably the moment Preston Yates climbed that cliff to save her. Dawn broke clear and cool, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed at odds with the grim purpose of the men gathering in front of the sheriff's office. Rosalie watched from her window as the posse prepared to ride out, easily identifying Preston among them by his height and the black stallion he rode. Despite her resolve not to worry, she couldn't help the knot of anxiety that formed in her stomach. "Mrs. Parker appeared at her door with coffee and fresh biscuits. "Thought you might want something to tide you over. Won't be much happening in town today with half the men riding out." "Do they often do this? Form posses to chase outlaws?" The older woman nodded, arranging the breakfast tray on a small table. "Part of life out here, but don't you worry, our boys know what they're doing, especially Deputy Yates." "His hands," Rosalie began, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "They haven't had time to heal." Mrs. Parker gave her a knowing look. "That man's fought through worse than sore hands, dear. There's steel in him." As the landlady left, Rosalie returned to the window just in time to see the posse riding out. Preston, at the front beside Sheriff Miller, turned in his saddle to glance back at the town, or perhaps, she allowed herself to hope, at the boarding house where she stood watching. The day stretched endlessly, each hour marked by Mrs. Parker finding increasingly unnecessary tasks to keep Rosalie occupied. By mid-afternoon, she had helped clean the dining room, sort linens, and prepare vegetables for the evening meal. Throughout it all, she found her thoughts returning to Preston and the danger he faced. "You've got it bad, don't you?" observed Mrs. Parker as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Rosalie nearly dropped the potato she was peeling. "I don't know what you mean." "You've checked that window 17 times in the last hour," the older woman said with a gentle smile. "And you jump like a startled rabbit every time the front door opens." "I'm just concerned about the posse," Rosalie defended, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Those men are risking their lives because of what I witnessed." Mrs. Parker patted her hand. "Of course they are, dear. But I've known Preston Yates for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you last night." Before Rosalie could process this statement or the flutter of hope, it caused the sound of horses approaching drew both women to the front window. A rider was galloping down the main street, his horse lathered with exertion. "That's young Thomas Miller, the sheriff's son," Mrs. Parker identified. "Something's happened." Propriety forgotten, Rosalie hurried outside just as the young man reined in his horse before a gathering crowd. His face was flushed with excitement as he delivered his news. "They got him," he announced triumphantly. "Caught the whole Blackwell gang trying to cross into Idaho territory. Pa sent me to tell everyone they'll be bringing them in tonight." A cheer went up from the townsfolk. Rosalie felt a wave of relief wash over her, quickly followed by a new anxiety. "Were there any injuries?" she asked, stepping forward. "Among the posse, I mean." Young Thomas shook his head. "Just a few scrapes." The Blackwells surrendered once they were surrounded. Even Ezra knew when he was outgunned. "And Deputy Yates?" The question slipped out before Rosalie could stop herself. Thomas grinned. "Cool as ice, Miss Fairchild," led the final approach himself. "Pa says to tell you specifically that the threat to your safety is over." As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with excitement over the capture, Rosalie found herself smiling despite the lingering concern. They were safe. Preston was safe. and soon she would see him again. The posse returned just after sunset, riding down the main street to cheers and applause from the townspeople. Sheriff Miller led the procession, followed by several deputies escorting 6 bound men, the infamous Blackwell gang, now defeated and headed for justice. Preston rode near the rear, his posture betraying exhaustion despite his alert gaze that swept continually over the prisoners. Rosalie stood with Mrs. Parker on the boarding house porch, watching as the procession passed. When Preston's eyes found hers in the crowd, something passed between them, a silent communication that made her heart beat faster. He nodded once, a gesture so slight others might have missed it, but to Rosalie it spoke volumes. "He'll be along once they've secured the prisoners, Mrs. Parker murmured knowingly. Best have some hot food waiting. Indeed, it was nearly 2 hours later when Preston finally appeared at the boarding house door. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and fresh dirt on his clothing, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "You did it," Rosalie said by way of greeting, ushering him inside where Mrs. Parker had kept a plate warm for him. Preston removed his hat, running a hand through hair that was matted with sweat and dust. "We did. Ezra Blackwell and his entire gang will stand trial in Helena next month, and the gold they stole, recovered, it'll continue to Helena under heavy guard tomorrow." He sank into a chair at the dining table with a weariness that suggested he might have remained standing through sheer willpower alone. "You're safe now, Rosalie. They can't hurt you." There was something in the way he said her name, something gentle and almost reverent that made her breath catch. As she placed the plate of food before him, their hands brushed briefly, and even that fleeting contact sent warmth spreading through her. "Your bandages need changing," she observed, noting the dirt and blood on his wrapped hands. Preston glanced down as if noticing his injuries for the first time. "It can wait until I've eaten. I'll get fresh bandages while you do." Rosalie moved toward the kitchen, pausing to look back at him. "Unless you'd prefer the doctor." "No," he said quickly, then more calmly. "No, I'd be grateful for your help." When she returned with clean bandages and a bowl of warm water, Preston had finished his meal and sat with a cup of coffee cradled awkwardly in his injured hands. Mrs. Parker had tactfully disappeared, leaving them alone in the dining room. Rosalie pulled her chair close to his and gently took one of his hands in hers. As she unwrapped the soiled bandage, she winced at the state of his palm, raw and torn, with fresh damage overlaying yesterday's wounds. "You shouldn't have gone," she murmured, carefully cleaning dirt from the abrasions. "Not without letting these heal first." "It was my job," Preston replied, his voice low. He didn't wince as she worked, though she knew the process must be painful. "And I needed to make sure they couldn't threaten you again." Rosalie looked up, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "You were protecting me specifically." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Preston nodded slowly. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Rosalie felt her heart quicken as she carefully wrapped fresh bandages around his hand, then moved to tend the other. They remained in silence as she worked, but it was a comfortable silence filled with a new awareness of each other. "The stage to Helena leaves tomorrow," Preston said finally as she secured the last bandage. "Sheriff arranged a special escort for you and the other passengers to make up for the interrupted journey." Oh, Rosalie hadn't expected to feel such disappointment at the news. Of course she should continue to Helena, her aunt was expecting her, and that had been the purpose of her journey from the beginning. Yet suddenly, the thought of leaving Silverwood, of leaving Preston, created an ache in her chest she hadn't anticipated. Unless you had other plans, he added, watching her face carefully. Rosalie hesitated. I was thinking about what you said yesterday about opportunities in Montana. For someone with business experience, Preston recalled, a hint of something like hope entering his expression. Yes. And about Mr. Jenkins possibly selling his general store. Rosalie gathered her courage. You think he might consider a buyer from California? The smile that spread across Preston's face was like sunrise breaking over mountains, transformative and full of promise. I think he might be persuaded, especially if that buyer had experience running a successful store in Sacramento. I would need to visit my aunt first, Rosalie continued, her own smile growing to match his. She's expecting me, after all. But after that, I could return to Silverwood and speak with Mr. Jenkins. I could escort you, Preston offered, then quickly added, for security given recent events. Rosalie's heart leapt at the suggestion. That would be very kind of you, Deputy Yates. Though I'd hate to take you away from your duties here. Sheriff owes me some time off, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. And ensuring the safety of a witness to the Blackwell robbery could be considered official business. They were interrupted by Mrs. Parker returning to clear the dishes, though the knowing smile she wore suggested she'd been listening from the kitchen. If you two are finished with your medical treatment, she said, emphasizing the words with twinkling eyes, perhaps Deputy Yates would escort Miss Fairchild for a short walk. The evening air is lovely, and the whole town's celebrating the capture. Preston raised an eyebrow at Rosalie in silent question. When she nodded, he rose and offered her his arm with formal courtesy that was belied by the warmth in his eyes. Outside, Silverwood had indeed transformed into a celebration. Lanterns hung along the main street, music spilled from the saloon, and townspeople gathered in small groups, sharing the excitement of the day's victory. Several called out congratulations to Preston as they passed, which he acknowledged with modest nods. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country bathed in moonlight. The distant mountains stood as silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, and for a moment, Rosalie was struck by the wild beauty of Montana territory. It grows on you, Preston observed, noting her appreciation. Took me about a year to stop comparing it to Virginia, where I was raised. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. How did you come to Montana? Rosalie asked, realizing how little she knew about him beyond his current role as deputy marshal. Preston was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. After the war, I fought for the Confederacy. Though I had no love for their cause, there wasn't much left for me in Virginia. My family's farm was destroyed, parents both gone. So I headed west, worked cattle drives for a few years, then fell into law work almost by accident. By accident. He smiled slightly at the memory. I helped a marshal track down a rustler who'd stolen horses from the ranch where I was working. He said I had a talent for it, offered me a deputy position. The rest, as they say, is history. And now you're tracking outlaws and rescuing damsels from cliffs, Rosalie teased gently. Quite the career progression. Preston's expression grew serious as he turned to face her fully. I've never regretted my choices, but until 2 days ago, I never found a reason to question whether this life was enough. The implication of his words hung in the night air between them. Rosalie's heart seemed to suspend its beating as she searched his face. And now, she asked softly. Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with bandaged fingers. Now I'm wondering what a general store owner from Sacramento might think of a life in Silverwood, Montana. If that might be something she'd consider. I think, Rosalie began, hardly daring to believe the turn her life had taken, that she might find such a prospect very appealing, especially if a certain deputy marshal were nearby. The tenderness in Preston's eyes as he looked at her made words unnecessary. When he lowered his head to hers, their lips met in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise, the promise of beginnings, of possibilities, of a future neither had imagined just days before. When they finally parted, Preston kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I know this is fast," he murmured. "Too fast, probably, but something happened on that cliff, Rosalie, something I can't explain but can't ignore either." "I feel it too," she admitted, her hand resting over his heart, as if that moment changed everything. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his serious face. "So what happens now?" "Now," Rosalie said, returning his smile with one of her own, "I visit my aunt in Helena. Then I return to Silverwood to discuss business with Mr. Jenkins. And perhaps, along the way, a deputy marshal and I might become better acquainted." "I'd like that," Preston replied, taking her hand in his bandaged one with infinite care. "I'd like that very much." As they walked back toward town beneath the vast Montana sky, Rosalie reflected on the strange turns life could take. 2 days ago, she had been hanging from a cliff, certain her life was about to end. Now she walked hand in hand with the man who had saved her, contemplating a future in this wild, beautiful territory that was rapidly claiming her heart, just as the man beside her had done. The journey to Helena passed without incident under the watchful protection of Sheriff Miller's deputies. Preston had reluctantly remained in Silverwood to oversee the temporary holding of the Blackwell gang, until federal marshals arrived to transport them to Helena for trial. Their parting had been bittersweet, tempered by the promise that he would follow within a week to escort her back to Silverwood if she still wished to return. "I'll wish it," Rosalie had assured him, the memory of their kiss still fresh on her lips. "Nothing in Helena will change my mind." Her Aunt Harriet proved to be less gravely ill than her letter had suggested, a fact that relieved Rosalie enormously, but also drew a confession from the older woman. "I may have exaggerated my condition slightly," Aunt Harriet admitted over tea in her comfortable parlor. "But I was worried about you, dear. Alone in Sacramento since your father's passing, working yourself to exhaustion in that store. I thought a change of scenery might do you good." "Well, your plan certainly worked," Rosalie replied with a smile, "though perhaps not in the way you intended." She recounted her adventure, from the stagecoach robbery to the cliff rescue to her burgeoning feelings for Preston Yates. Aunt Harriet listened with wide eyes, occasionally gasping at particularly dramatic moments. "My goodness," she exclaimed when Rosalie had finished. "And this deputy marshal, he's coming to Helena to escort you back to Silverwood. Yes, he should arrive within the week." Rosalie couldn't prevent the blush that rose to her cheeks at the mention of Preston. "He's remarkable, Aunt Harriet, unlike anyone I've ever known." Her aunt studied her thoughtfully. "You're in love with him." It wasn't a question, but Rosalie answered anyway. "I think I am. Is that ridiculous? We've known each other such a short time. Love doesn't always follow a predictable timeline, my dear." Aunt Harriet patted her hand. "Your Uncle Albert proposed to me after knowing me for just 10 days. We had 42 wonderful years together before he passed. But Silverwood is so far from Sacramento." "From you," Rosalie worried. "Helena is already far from Sacramento," her aunt pointed out practically. "And I'm not getting any younger. Perhaps I might consider joining you in Silverwood eventually, if this store purchase comes to fruition." The next few days passed in a flurry of activity, as Rosalie helped her aunt with household tasks and explored Helena, which was considerably larger and more developed than Silverwood. She inquired discreetly about the reputation of the Silverwood General Store and was pleased to hear it was considered a solid business. Each day, she checked at the telegraph office for messages from Preston, and on the 5th day of her stay, her patience was rewarded. Arriving tomorrow's stop, Blackwell's transferred to federal custody. Stop. Hope you still wish to return to Silverwood. Stop. Preston. Rosalie clutched the telegram to her chest, happiness bubbling through her veins like champagne. She immediately sent a reply. Will meet your stage. Stop. Still very much wish to return. Stop. Rosalie. The following day found Rosalie waiting at the stage depot, her heart pounding with anticipation. When Preston finally stepped down from the coach, looking travel-worn but alert, it took all her self-restraint not to fling herself into his arms in full view of Helena's citizens. Instead, she offered her hand formally, which he took in both of his. The bandages were gone, she noted, though his palms still bore healing marks from the cliff rescue. "Miss Fairchild," he greeted her, his eyes saying far more than his words. "You're looking well." "As are you, Deputy Yates," she replied, unable to suppress her smile. "My aunt is expecting us for dinner, if you're not too tired from your journey. I'd be honored to meet her." Aunt Harriet took an immediate liking to Preston, as Rosalie had known she would. Over a hearty dinner, they discussed Silverwood, the general store, and the upcoming trial of the Blackwell gang. "I understand you'll be required to testify," Preston said to Rosalie. "The federal prosecutor sent papers ahead on my stage." "Yes, I received the summons yesterday." Rosalie had been prepared for this requirement. "The trial is set for 3 weeks from now, which gives us time to return to Silverwood, speak with Jenkins about the store, and come back to Helena for the proceedings," Preston concluded, "if that aligns with your plans." The consideration in his tone, his careful avoidance of presuming her intentions, only deepened Rosalie's growing feelings for him. "It aligns perfectly," she assured him. Later that evening, with Aunt Harriet tactfully retired early, they walked in the small garden behind the house. The night was warm, with fireflies creating their own constellations among the flowering shrubs. "I missed you," Preston admitted, taking her hand as they followed the garden path. "More than I expected to." "I missed you too," Rosalie replied, leaning slightly against his arm. "Helena is lovely, but it didn't feel right without you here." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light filtering from the house windows. "I've been thinking, Rosalie, about us, about Silverwood, about what might be possible." Her heart quickened. "What conclusions did you reach?" "That I want you in my life," he said simply. "That the week we were apart confirmed what I suspected on that cliff, that meeting you has changed everything for me." Rosalie reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "It's changed everything for me too, Preston. I was content in Sacramento, but not truly happy. Not like this." He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, then drew her closer. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be too soon, even for us. But I am asking if you'll give us a chance. If you'll come back to Silverwood, not just for the store, but for possibilities." "Yes," Rosalie whispered, rising on tiptoes to bring her face closer to his. "I want those possibilities, Preston, all of them." Their kiss was deeper than their first, filled with growing certainty and the promise of a shared future. When they finally parted, Preston kept her close in the circle of his arms. "Jenkins will sell," he told her. "I sent a telegram before leaving Silverwood. He's eager to retire and has no family interested in the business. He'll discuss terms with you when we return." "You were that certain I'd want to come back," Rosalie teased. Preston smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I was hoping, very intensely hoping." 2 days later, they began the journey back to Silverwood. this time traveling by private wagon rather than stagecoach. The slower pace allowed them to truly appreciate the magnificent Montana landscape and provided precious time alone together, away from the curious eyes of townsfolk. They talked for hours as Preston guided the horses along the trail about their childhoods, their dreams, their experiences during the war years. Rosalie learned that Preston had a younger sister living in St. Louis whom he hadn't seen in years, but corresponded with regularly. Preston discovered that Rosalie had trained as a teacher before her father's illness had called her home to help with the store. "You could teach in Silverwood," he suggested as they made camp the first evening. "The town's growing. There's talk of building a proper schoolhouse next year." "Perhaps eventually," Rosalie mused, helping him prepare their simple supper. "But first I want to establish the store, make it my own." Preston nodded approvingly. "You have good business sense. Jenkins has let things slide the past few years. There's room for improvement." As night fell, they sat beside their small fire, closer than propriety might strictly allow but within the bounds of respectability. Aunt Harriet had raised eyebrows at their traveling alone together, but had ultimately given her blessing, recognizing the unusual circumstances of their relationship. "What will people in Silverwood think?" Rosalie wondered, watching the flames dance. "About us, I mean. It's all happened so quickly." Preston considered this. "There'll be talk, of course. There always is in small towns, but you've already won over Mrs. Parker, which means half the battle is won. And the other half will be won when they see who you are: kind, intelligent, determined." He squeezed her hand. "Just be yourself, Rosalie. The rest will follow." Their arrival in Silverwood 3 days later caused the expected stir of interest. Mrs. Parker welcomed Rosalie back with genuine warmth, immediately offering her old room at the boarding house, "for as long as you need, dear, while you sort out permanent arrangements." The meeting with Mr. Jenkins went even better than anticipated. The elderly storekeeper was indeed eager to sell and retire to live with his son in Denver. His price was fair, and after a thorough inventory of the store's stock and examination of the account books, Rosalie was confident she could make the business profitable with some strategic improvements. "I'll need to return to Sacramento eventually," she explained to Preston as they walked along Silverwood's Main Street after finalizing the preliminary agreement with Jenkins. "To sell my father's share of the business there and collect my personal belongings." "I'll come with you," Preston offered immediately. Once the Blackwell trial is concluded, the thought of introducing Preston to her home, of showing him the places that had shaped her, filled Rosalie with unexpected delight. "I'd like that very much." Life in Silverwood quickly fell into a pleasant rhythm. Rosalie spent her days learning the intricacies of Jenkins' store, while Preston resumed his duties as deputy marshal. In the evenings, they often walked together or sat on the boarding house porch, planning improvements for the store and cautiously discussing a shared future. Word of their developing relationship spread through town with predictable speed. But as Preston had predicted, any initial skepticism was largely overcome by Rosalie's genuine warmth and business acumen. By the time they departed for Helena for the Blackwell trial, she had already been accepted as a future permanent resident of Silverwood. The trial itself was a tense affair. Ezra Blackwell glared at Rosalie throughout her testimony, his pale eyes cold with hatred as she identified him as the leader of the stagecoach robbery. Preston remained constantly at her side outside the courtroom, his protective presence a source of comfort against the outlaw's silent threats. "He can't hurt you," Preston reminded her as they returned to Aunt Harriet's house after a particularly difficult day in court. "He'll hang for his crimes, Rosalie. You're safe." "I know," she assured him, though the memory of Blackwell's icy stare lingered uncomfortably. It's just unnerving to be the focus of such hatred. Preston's jaw tightened. I understand, but it will be over soon. Indeed, justice moved swiftly. Within 2 weeks, Ezra Blackwell and his gang were convicted on multiple counts of robbery, assault, and murder. The judge sentenced them to hang, bringing a definitive end to their reign of terror in the Montana Territory. As they prepared to return to Silverwood following the trial, Aunt Harriet surprised Rosalie with an announcement. "I've decided to sell this house," she declared over breakfast. "It's too large for me alone, and Helena holds too many memories of your uncle. I think I'll join you in Silverwood if you'll have me." "Aunt Harriet, of course we'll have you." Rosalie embraced the older woman joyfully. "But are you certain? It's a much smaller town than Helena." "All the better for keeping an eye on my niece and her handsome deputy," Aunt Harriet replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Besides, I'm told Silverwood lacks a proper millinery shop. Perhaps I'll open a small business of my own." Preston, who had been quietly buttering toast during this exchange, looked up with approval. "Mrs. Fairchild, you'd be most welcome. And you're right about the millinery situation. The ladies of Silverwood currently travel to Helena for fashionable hats." "Then it's settled," Aunt Harriet declared. "I'll follow you to Silverwood once my affairs here are in order, perhaps in a month or two." Their return journey to Silverwood was filled with plans and possibilities. Rosalie's purchase of Jenkins' store would be finalized within the week, and Preston had been discussing a potential promotion with Sheriff Miller that would increase his responsibilities and salary. "He's thinking of retiring within the year," Preston explained as they traveled. "Says he might recommend me as his replacement if I'm interested." "Sheriff Yates," Rosalie tested the title. "It has a distinguished ring to it." "It would mean staying in Silverwood permanently," he pointed out, "building a life there." The implication was clear, and Rosalie's heart swelled with emotion. "I think Silverwood would be a wonderful place to build a life, Preston. Together." The look he gave her was full of such tender promise that words became unnecessary. Their future was taking shape with each passing day, built on a foundation that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances on a moonlit cliff, where a desperate rescue had sparked something neither had expected to find. 2 months later, as summer yielded to the first hints of autumn, Rosalie stood behind the counter of Fairchild's general store, formerly Jenkins' establishment, but now transformed under her ownership. The shelves were neatly organized, stock had been replenished and expanded, and business was thriving under her management. Aunt Harriet had indeed followed through on her plan, arriving in Silverwood 3 weeks earlier with her belongings, and immediately charming the townsfolk with her refined manners and plans for a millinery shop. She had taken rooms at Mrs. Parker's boarding house temporarily, while searching for suitable retail space. The bell above the door jingled, and Rosalie looked up to see Preston entering, still wearing his marshal's badge, but now complemented by the sheriff's star. Sheriff Miller had retired earlier than expected due to health concerns, and Preston had been appointed in his place 2 weeks prior. "Sheriff Yates," Rosalie greeted him warmly. "What brings you to my humble establishment this afternoon?" Preston removed his hat, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Official business, Miss Fairchild, very serious." "Oh," she raised an eyebrow, playing along. "And what might that be?" He approached the counter and reached into his pocket, withdrawing not a wanted poster or official document but a small velvet box. Rosalie's breath caught as he placed it on the counter between them. "This establishment lacks something essential," he said, his voice low and suddenly serious. "A partnership." With trembling fingers, Rosalie opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. Preston, I know it's only been 3 months, he began, reaching across the counter to take her hand. But I've known since that night on the cliff that you were the one I wanted to build a life with. I love you, Rosalie Fairchild. Will you marry me? Tears of joy blurred her vision as she rounded the counter to stand before him. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Preston Yates, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. You've changed everything, he murmured. That day on the cliff was just the beginning. The beginning of the most wonderful adventure, Rosalie agreed, her heart so full of love she thought it might overflow. The wedding took place that November in Silverwood's small church, with Aunt Harriet beaming proudly from the front pew and Mrs. Parker dabbing at tears throughout the ceremony. The entire town turned out to celebrate the union of their sheriff and the proprietress of Fairchild's General Store, two people whose love story had already become something of a local legend. Have you ever regretted it? Preston asked quietly as they danced at their wedding reception. Running from that stagecoach, nearly falling from that cliff. Rosalie looked up at her husband, at the face that had become dearer to her than any other in the world, and shook her head. Not for a moment. Every step, every decision led me to you, even the dangerous ones. Especially those, she replied with a smile. After all, you did promise to climb until your hands bled. Preston's arms tightened around her. And I always will, Rosalie. Whatever cliff you find yourself on, I'll always come for you. As winter settled over Silverwood, the newlyweds settled into their life together in the small house Preston had purchased on the edge of town. Each morning, he would walk her to the store before beginning his sheriff's duties, and each evening they would return home together, building the foundation of a marriage that grew stronger with each passing day. Spring brought the news that Aunt Harriet's millinery shop would open in May, occupying the space next to Fairchild's General Store. Summer brought whispers of expansion for the town as the railroad considered extending a line to Silverwood, potentially bringing new prosperity to the community. And autumn crisp, golden autumn brought the most wonderful news of all, as Rosalie confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. A baby, Preston repeated, his expression transforming from shock to wonder as Rosalie shared the doctor's confirmation. We're going to have a baby. Next spring, she nodded, laughing as he lifted her into his arms and spun her around their kitchen. Preston, put me down, we have to be careful now. He set her gently on her feet but kept her close in his embrace. A family, he marveled. Our family. As they stood together in the home they had made, with the future stretching bright before them, Rosalie thought back to that terrifying moment on the cliff, her fingers slipping, her strength failing, and then the miraculous appearance of Preston Yates, climbing toward her with determination that defied the impossible odds. I'll climb till my hands bleed, he had promised, and in doing so had not only saved her life but had set them both on a path neither could have imagined. From that perilous moment had grown love, partnership, and now the promise of a new generation, a full circle of life and hope in the wild Montana territory they now called home. Their story, which began with danger and desperation, had transformed into one of the greatest love stories Silverwood had ever known. And as winter snow once again blanketed the town, Preston and Rosalie Yates looked toward the future with hearts full of gratitude for the cliff that had brought them together, and the courage that had allowed them to find each other against all odds.